Johanna, thank you very much for helping with this project. It's extremely difficult to find any information about ResearchOps, so I'm very grateful for sharing your insights on that.
Yeah, thank you for asking me. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. To start with, can you describe a little bit what you do, what companies you typically work with?
Yeah, for sure. So I am currently a full-time freelancer UX researcher, and I also do UX advising. So I like to simplify it by just saying, I ask people, do you want my brain or my hands? And sometimes it's both. So I can come in and be someone who advises and who coaches people and tells them, this is something where you can have more impact, or this is the best way to go about something. This is how you really create your strategy, or this is how you should try and kind of clarify what goals you have. But I'm also someone who loves doing research, and I hope I'll never stop doing research because it's something I really enjoy, to talk to people, to find out about what drives them, what are their motivations, what are their pain points. So that's also something that I do, but I'd say it's rather in a more like strategic research direction. So I often work with big companies, German companies, because I'm from Germany, that's quite common, and help them with research projects like, who are our target customers? What are their jobs to be done, for example? Or we have a value proposition. Is this really something that's worthwhile? Should we invest into this? So it's usually these big topics where they need someone to really help them run quality research and to get those answers to them, basically. So that's what I do. And the second part of your question was what kind of companies I work with typically. So I mentioned already, it's usually bigger companies. So I would say it's usually companies that do have research teams, but they don't have the capabilities maybe. So I work with companies like Stepstone or Just Eat, for example. I worked with Lego before. Like, there's a whole bunch of different industries as well. But I also work with startups. I like the idea of coming in companies where they are not quite as settled, and really helping them to run some research, even though there's not this infrastructure already there. But I also have to say it's quite challenging. Like, this is not something you can just do and it takes a couple of days, but this is usually weeks and weeks and like lots of work you have to put in. So yeah, so it's a wild mix.
Interesting. So when you said companies on the large side, what's the size of the company and what's the typical size of the UX team?
Yeah, so large companies means thousands of employees, I would say. So that goes from like more than 1,000 to really like tens of thousands. So some of them are really global and really, really big. And when it comes to research teams, that's an interesting question because that is often quite the opposite. Like, it's very few people. So I feel like oftentimes it's rather one or two lead researchers, and then there are a few mid-level researchers maybe. So the most common team size I see is maybe about 5 people. And then oftentimes
Johanna, hold on. I apologize that there's a police car outside. It's East London, yeah. So sometimes it happens. Let us
I
just.
don't feel that at all. I mean, the noise cancelling is really good.
Yeah. Google is doing a good job, but again, as soon as I'm recording on my side, it's embarrassing. Okay, I think it's gone. They didn't find me. Okay, that's good. We can go forward. So you said that about in terms of the research team, it can be the other way around.
Yeah. What I mean by that is that they're typically very small. Like, it's oftentimes maybe around 5 people. So oftentimes maybe 1 or 2 lead researchers who kind of lead the efforts, lead the team, and then a few more mid-level or even junior researchers who kind of support the really hands-on work, who really run the studies and really execute the things that are on the roadmap maybe. So that's also one of the reasons why I often come in, because there's just not enough capability to cover all the things they want to do. But yeah, it's quite interesting, I feel, because really in those big companies, you would expect that there are a lot more researchers. It's often just a really small team, and often centralized, by the way. Like, I know there's different methods or different ways you can structure a team, but it's very often centralized. So one team that is kind of catering to the needs of other teams. So it's not integrated, for example, in product teams or so.
I see. So basically, as far as I understand, it's usually typically a large company in terms of their total number of employees, but in terms of the UX team, it can be structured in a wildly different way.
Yeah, that's true also. Yeah, it can be quite different.
in terms of your your work, you said that they can either get your brain or hands. So in this case, do you conduct research itself, or do you help other people to conduct research? And what's there for where does it meet the middle?
Mm-hmm. I do both, and I have to say, one of the things I've been doing for a few years before is really to just do the coaching part. So the title that I had was research partner at the time, and I think it's quite a nice descriptive title in a way, because I was partnering with companies and then telling them, hey, you want to go into card sorting, you've never done it before, so these are the things that are really important about this method, or this is the best way to analyze once you've run a study. So that's something I have been doing for a long time and that I really enjoy doing. However, I feel like the need in the market right now, at least in my bubble maybe, is more this, okay, we really need someone to go all the way, like to not only tell us this is the best approach. For example, they have an OKR, company OKR, and they just don't know how to reach it because there's no capability to kind of do it, no manpower, so to say. So more often than not, it's really me who goes all the way and who then says, okay, this is a proposed study design, let's discuss it, let's talk about how we do it. Then I can sometimes even come in to get the participants. This is something where I like to push back a lot, because I think recruitment is just not something you can do on the side. Like, it's very complex often. It's something where you need additional resource. But then I also go away and run sessions, like interviews, for example, and also analyze. There are some cases where it's really just the language aspect, because I'm a German native speaker, that people say, hey, we are running these projects, but we're maybe based in the US and we just need someone to speak German so we can learn more about our German market. So that's also something that I do, but that's kind of more of a niche aspect, I would say.
Interesting. And on the ops side of the business, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, recruitment, I already mentioned, that's something where a lot of companies don't really have their own panel. They don't really have someone who's maybe a recruitment specialist or someone who can take care of this. But I think it's really essential, because the quality of the research can really fall if you don't have the right participants. If you just try to ask your family for the 5th time, or like some friends that you have, this is not the way it's supposed to work, especially for those more strategic topics. And I think that's really a big challenge for a lot of companies, is that they don't really have the recruitment. They don't have that understanding also of, you need to invest a lot to get high quality participants. And what I mean by that is that very often when we run research, is rather this, we will give them a gift card for X amount, and it's typically not very high also. And I think that's problematic, because already before you are looking at the participants that might be willing to take part, you have introduced some bias, because these are only the people that are willing to do something for this kind of amount of money that you offer. So the recruitment part is definitely the biggest part, I would say. But the other thing is, and I guess we've talked about this before as well, is the structures, the processes. I feel like so often when there's a new project on the horizon, that teams are like, oh yeah, we need to take care of this. Like, we need to solve it. We need to get to some results. But there is not really a very structured way to do it. So very rarely I see proper research plans, for example, like a document where you kind of map out all the things that are existing already, the method, the participants you're aiming for. Like, this is also something, this whole process of project management part is also often missing, I would say, or it's not something that people will spend a lot of time. So if I had to say, like, what's the biggest theme that I see, it's definitely these two, I would say. But of course, research ops can mean a lot of other things as well.
Yeah. One next thing I think you mentioned during your talk at the last ops conference was working on repositories, and you gave a lot of good advice on that. So as far as I understand, it's you mentioned recruitment, then helping with the process. Repositories basically is one of the tools that researchers used.
Yes.
Anything else? What do you think are other pieces of the puzzle in the research ops picture?
Yeah, I mean, and that's probably, maybe I just didn't think of it right now, because I'm still in this kind of, okay, when you prepare research, these are the things that often go wrong. But I would definitely say the whole aspect of knowledge management, so not just repositories, that does not equal knowledge management, but rather the whole idea of how do we actually then deal with our insights? How do we make them accessible? How do we make sure that people understand them? And how do we not limit this access to people who then have to say, okay, I was the person running that research. I can send you a report, or I can tell you something about it. So it's definitely also a very big area. And it's something that a lot of companies are maybe not even thinking about so much. And that's maybe why I didn't mention it before, because I see that oftentimes it's just kind of almost an accepted pain. Is that, yeah, that's how it is, when you come in. And I just recently started a new kind of long-term project, then it's like, yeah, okay, I need to see what are the existing insights. And it's always like, I don't know, you can ask this person, and then this person will give you the next name, and then so on and so on. And that's how a lot of time is lost, and a lot of actual insights are lost, because not everyone can remember something they have done maybe a year ago. So that's definitely the third biggest area, I would say. So yeah, it's definitely those, but I've seen flavors of, I guess, all the different areas of ResearchOps being poorly staffed, maybe poorly executed. I also know, and I'm in this Slack community for ResearchOps, and I think that's probably the biggest community that there is in this area, that a lot of people are also reporting is quite challenging to be in this area right now, because layoffs have also impacted roles like that. And I mean, that's probably a bigger conversation to have, like bigger discussion, but it's definitely, I think, one of those roles where the people who are not directly involved might not really immediately see the value of this, even though it's very big. Like, it's very essential to have proper research ops and to equip people with the right tools and processes to do their jobs in the best possible way. But they've also been kind of impacted by companies saying, how can we get to the lowest number of people in this area and still do what we're doing? Yeah.
Interesting. So after we talked a little bit about different sides of ResearchOps, can you give a definition of what do you think ResearchOps is? Because the more I talk to people, the more definitions I have, and which is probably a good thing at the moment. Like, we need to identify a very broad area first, and then I think we can go down and shrink it a little bit to make it more accurate. So your perspective on what ResearchOps is, and maybe what it is not.
Yeah, I like the question, and it's one of those things where it makes me smile, because you never really think about it so actively. Like, for me, it's quite clear what it is, but to articulate that is probably not so easy. But it's definitely around the people side of things. So I think good research ops is always around making people successful in their jobs. And that can mean a lot of things. It can mean the processes, as I said before. It can mean the tools that they're using, can mean the structure, the ways of working that they have, but also other things that equip them well, for example, templates or standardizing processes. So it all comes down to really helping people do their best job. And what it is not then is just maybe things like, automating as much as possible. So I think for a lot of people, that's like, okay, we have this problem, we're not really efficient, so let's do a big round of, okay, this is our standardized way of doing things now, and everyone stick to it, and that's problem solved, so to say. So I think it's much more nuanced than that, and it really comes down to the people, and people are very individual, teams are very individual, their needs are very individual. So it's really around understanding this and then finding solutions that work. And that might really, again, that might mean different things in different companies and different teams.
Interesting. What I really like about your definition is, it's interesting you said it's about people, and then you mention a lot of things that support those people, like processes, tools, and so on. Because I totally agree. I see it all the time when, if there is an issue, there are basically two very simple ways to address the issue. The first one is, let's just tell people to do it differently, get job done, which never works. Because you need the process. And I think the best definition of the process I've ever heard is, it's kind of the reverse definition, which is, if people can forget to do something, it's not a process. Like, if you told people to do something and then next time they are distracted and don't do it, and you didn't have a process to start with. Or the second approach is completely reverse, which is, okay, people cannot do that. We told them they forgot, so we need to do something else, which is 100% automation. So we'll hire someone who will build a system that always works and never fails, which never works either. So I really like your definition of kind of, it's people, but people supported by processes, correct tools, and like the whole system working together rather than breaking it apart and hoping for the best.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, it all comes down to the people. I see this so often that companies say, okay, we have a problem with how we manage knowledge, for example, and then they go away and find budget somewhere, and then they buy a repository tool, and then they think that's almost problem solved. But it's not. It's not until the people who are supposed to use it are happy to use it and find value in it and so on. And these things, that's where the real challenge is. It's not to go away and Google something and look like pages that compare tools maybe, or compare costs or whatever. It really comes down to, can we make people change their behavior in this way that they are also on board and that they can integrate this into their lives? And that's just something I've seen over the years so many times. Like, that's where a lot of these projects really fail, because oftentimes we will just go away and say, yeah, I know a solution for this and we will buy this tool, and then that's us settled. Or we will, I mean, it's maybe a bit extreme to say, but we will buy a consulting firm and give them millions, and then they will tell us, this is our standardized process, and you just have to implement it in your company, plug it in, and then you're good to go. It's very dangerous to think that this will always be a solution. It can work. I'm not saying that it's always a bad thing, but I think it's always, it's very often oversimplified to things like that.
In your perspective, what typical issues you saw people and big companies having while working with repositories? What usually doesn't work?
So I can definitely reference my article there, because it's kind of the condensed learnings I've had over the years. And the first thing that really comes to mind is that oftentimes in these big companies, what people do is they focus so much on their current solution, and they don't, or they can't at this point, think about where they really want to go. And what I mean by that is, I've had so many kickoffs with companies back when I worked at Indoor HQ and was the person responsible to onboard and to advise people in the EMEA region, was really that in those kickoffs, they would say, yeah, we have these 20,000 people and we have these 10 different areas, and we need to translate this into the system. And it's so overly complex, they would tell me from the beginning. And it's just incredibly hard already to think about how we do things. And then a lot of the conversations would kind of revolve around this. How do we get this massive system of, like, we have 10 years of historical research. Like, how do we get all of this over to the system? It's impossible. It's so difficult. It's going to take forever. We've already spent months doing stuff and kind of preparing for this. And at the beginning, I kind of joined them in feeling so overwhelmed and being like, okay, this really is impossible. I don't know the solution either. But now I've kind of shifted my thinking and helping people to do the same, in kind of saying, okay, this is the past. And we are now at a point in time where we can define what an ideal solution should be like, or how we want to move forward. It doesn't have to mean that everything you have done in the past has to have a place in this. And that's something where I read a really good book around that recently, which is Building a Second Brain by Tiago Forte. This concept of having a second brain, that's kind of what the title says. Like, it's okay if not everything is in one place. And for that analogy is kind of in your head, but it's okay if you have a separate place where you store certain things. And you can apply this to repositories as well and say, we have those 1,000 reports from the past, and they are in this place, they are secure, they can be accessed. But from now on, what we're building is a new solution, and it's a better solution. And it's something where we've applied all the good principles of knowledge management, and we are just going to move forward. And I think that's where a lot of lightness comes from, because people then say, oh yeah, we can actually move forward. We don't have to spend the next year just trying to pull things out of our archive and index them and kind of do all of this painful work. But we can actually move forward and think about, how do we want the future to look like? So yeah, but really coming back to the question is really this being so overwhelmed and feeling so weighed down by what you already have. I think that's really one of the biggest issues that people have. And the other thing that's really related to this is trying to do it perfectly. And it sounds so simple, and I think it's something that people know from all areas of life, basically. But with repositories, I feel like it's especially strong, is that suddenly people really think like, if we cannot do this perfectly, we shouldn't be doing it. Like they, for example, they buy a tool, they have the license and they're ready to go, but they are kind of pushing it out again and again and again. And when I'm talking to them about it and trying to find out why that is, it's very often like, yeah, we need to first figure out our taxonomy. It's not perfect yet. I don't feel well like putting it into the platform. It doesn't look nice. There's something missing. We need to workshop this more and so on. Or things like, even I need to make sure that our strategy is flawless and is perfect, because otherwise when senior management will see it, they will not buy into the idea. They will think it's not great. Like they will smash it down, like the thoughts like that. Whereas I'm just thinking, in all the other areas like UX research, it's so uncommon actually to think like that, because oftentimes the way I see it and the way a lot of people I work with see it is like, you run a study, you learn from it, maybe it wasn't perfect. Of course, it should be done well, like should be quality, it should be thought through, but it's okay if it's not perfect, because the next time we will improve, and the next time we will have learned from this, and then we will maybe tweak a few things. But with repositories, I feel like there's this very strong sense of this needs to be so good, like this needs to be so perfect, but it's especially hard to do because it's even more like at a higher level. You're aggregating things, you are thinking about structuring things, and like taxonomy, it's not very tangible. Like it's this concept you have to think about, like you have to create something, but it's very hard to do it if you've never done it. So I feel like that's really holding a lot of people back so much. And it doesn't have to be, because that's also something I always say is you have to start small and then expand later. So the first taxonomy should not be an almost final taxonomy. It shouldn't be this huge thing where there's lots and lots of things and you don't even remember what's in there. It should be super small. And then once you realize we need to add something, add it, but don't add things that maybe you will never use. And then they will collect dust, and then they will just clutter your whole taxonomy. You know, it's rather the other way around. It's great if it's not perfect, because that means you should get started and then you can move from there.
Interesting. I think that results in basically two extra questions. The first one is, so what you are saying means that people can start with not a perfect taxonomy or categorization, like any part of the system, right? For multiple reasons. First of all, they don't know, but I think the fundamental reason is in UX research, by definition, it's research, right? You don't know what's going to happen in the future. If you knew, it wouldn't be research at all, which also means that you don't know what's going to happen in half a year. So maybe you'll look back and figure out that actually taxonomy, being perfect right now, needs to change to fit the new goals in half a year, right? So your perfect taxonomy today is not a perfect taxonomy for tomorrow.
Yeah.
Which also means that all the tools that we use right now, they should allow that taxonomy evolution, right? Without disrupting and breaking the whole system apart. In your experience, do they allow that kind of flexible and graceful failing on taxonomy and other aspects of their I think for the organization, it's the first brain. It's not even the second brain like for us. For the first and the single brain that we're building.
That's such an interesting question. And I'm just reflecting back on the things that I've already seen and how I would see that. And I must say that it's probably not quite there yet. Like the systems are not the way they should be for many reasons, but I'm trying to focus on your question and not like, covering completely different things. But I do think that it looks nicer in the tools if you have something that's quite polished. For example, if you upload a lot of things first and then you want to narrow down in the platform, it's often very hard to do so. So that's why I've seen a lot of teams, do things like a mirror board first, because there you can move things around and it doesn't look final. Like it's very clearly work in progress. But once you've uploaded things, sometimes in some tools, it's not as easy to kind of tidy this up. There are options very often to say like consolidate something, for example, but it's something that's you have to actively spot something and then be like, oh, there's a problem here. I need to fix this. Like I need to tidy this up. And I think that's where a lot of frustration also comes from once people start to use it, because then they have this mindset like, okay, this should be a version that is usable. That's something that we can kind of work with now. But then they realize it's actually a lot of effort to tidy things up and to keep it clean and to keep it nice and, put together. So I feel like, no, a lot of times it's not very easy to do that in the tools. Also from an interface point of view, because you have to go into the settings and then have to go into like, this is a tag board or this is a field board or whatever. Like you have to search first to go into something that feels like it's almost hidden. And then, that's the one part of it. The usability, I think, sometimes lacks in these tools to make it really easy and simple. The other thing is that it's quite difficult for a lot of teams to then decide who do we give access to this. And I mention this because in the context of this question, I also see the issue that when you have, for example, designers or product managers, and these are kind of one of the early adopters in the platform, oftentimes when you give them the ability to edit things or to add things and then, analyze them, process them in whatever way that seems fit to them, they are often also allowed to change the taxonomy. And that is where it gets so tricky, because when people don't know the first version of the taxonomy really, but they are just trying to apply things, and they see that the option is to just start typing and then something is added to the taxonomy, it suddenly gets unmanageable for the person responsible to really keep an eye on taxonomy in general. And I think it's not even this question of first version or iterating and so on, but it's rather the maintenance of it generally is usually not something that's very easy across the tools that I've seen and worked with, at least. Yeah.
Interesting. That resonated a lot with my experience, where when I worked in the Android team, I usually tried to bring the product team engineers as well to the observation room when I'm conducting studies. And I remember some people started to add tags to their to the video that were like super technical. Like, for example, they mentioned specific functions that needed to be changed in the code and so on. And initially I was frustrated a little bit, because I wanted to kind of to summarize what we see in terms of user experience rather than super technical things. But then I saw how they discussed everything, and for them it was, okay, so as soon as we have all those tags, we now can group them by teams that work on the different features, and that makes it much easier for them to update the product and to fix bugs.
Yeah.
And I thought, hold on, so my ultimate goal actually is not to have a perfect taxonomy that I can admire, like just stare on that and like it a lot. The ultimate goal is to help to improve the product, right? And to do that, what they did actually much better than kind of my idea was. So I totally understand what you're saying about the difficulty of people with different perspectives coming and kind of breaking the perfect taxonomy that smart people created for everyone. But on the other hand, that's the whole point of having the tool, is to make it useful for people who actually make changes in the product.
Yeah, and that's what I meant with the definition. Like, it really comes down to the people. And I firmly believe, like, if a taxonomy or like if a repository tool in general is not really working for people, is eventually they will not use it. Like, they will find ways to go around it or to avoid it, and it will not be adopted as you want it to. And that's what's making it so incredibly difficult. Like, there's so many best practices around this and so much advice, I think, but essentially it really comes down to how can people use this and how will they find value in it. And this kind of brings me to another thing that I really realized working with a lot of different teams, is that what's really difficult about repositories is that it can be so many different things. It can look so different for every single company. Like, just because there are certain concepts and maybe an intended way to use them doesn't mean that you have to first. And it also doesn't mean that it will give you the same value that the company maybe anticipated. So yeah, I've seen cases where, for example, the company has used it almost like a folder structure. And I was always thinking like, what, and I mean by that, one folder for one research project. And that's it. Like that was the whole structure. And I was just thinking that is so not the way that repositories are meant to work. Like it's interconnected, you know, you are using tags and you use search and so on. But for them, and we discussed this a really long time, for them, essentially, in the end, it was the best way to use it. And that was just something that we all had to accept. Like, you know, it's okay. It's not the way that the system is built. But for them at this point in time, with the structure they have, with the people that work with it, that was just what worked. And I think that's such an important takeaway. Because some people then get really frustrated if they see the intended way, or they go to a company demo from a tool, for example, and then there's usually just this one way how things are being presented. And this is how you use this, and this is how you use that. And then they don't find themselves in this solution. And then I think like, okay, that's not for me. Like, okay, we need to find another tool. Like,
interesting. You know, like listening to what you're saying, I realized that I think there is a huge gap between where we are at the moment in reality, because we're basically at the moment, as far as I understand, we're in a situation where it's extremely difficult to just record even videos or audio recording from talking to users in a way that people can find in half a year, right? This is one of the biggest issues as far as I understand. At the same time, every time I talk to a research team, when they describe what they actually need, it's so much further from there. It's like, oh, we want to be able to, for example, to group by different clusters, and the cluster is not just a word, it's a cluster of it's a concept. Like, for example, one typical issue we had in the Android team was that there were so many different features that are kind of categorized in the same manner. Like, for example, I don't know, a reminder, right? There were at least 5 different teams working on different types of reminders, and all of them was called slightly differently. And then was another team, for example, that worked on the alarm clock. And for users, it's just a reminder, right? I want to be reminded in the morning that I need to wake up and do something. And for the backend people, we're like, no, it's a completely different thing. It's not even the same. It's not even built in the same country. Like, it's a completely different office. So, and researchers wanted to cluster everything around the user concept rather than how it's called in the backend. And even that was extremely difficult because it just, so that means they need to sit and think about all 65 different words that developers can use to call one thing. So that gap between we don't have a reliable tool to store everything easily and find in half a year, and at the same time researchers need a completely different kind of magic world where they can type whatever they want and they can just rediscover all the insights from users. How do you think we can at least start closing that gap?
Well, that's a big question. I feel like just hearing you talk about it, I feel like the way I always envision the perfect tool is to kind of go away from people having to put a lot of time and effort into creating things, like a story, for example, like, you know, this is a summary of whatever research I just ran, because I feel like that's already creating friction. But it's almost like this analogy of walking into a supermarket with like your basket and you need some things. You go shopping, so to say, like that feels very simple, very easy. You can just walk around and you can grab whatever is relevant to you. And I think the ideal tool, or the gap between what we have right now and what that ideal solution would be like, is really to make things available in that kind of sense. And I don't have the answer to this in that sense. Like, I don't know how we could do it, but I feel like maybe the answer is really to have some level of modularity that will allow us to do that. Because and I guess that's quite the standard right now, is to go away and then say, I'm uploading this report from the past. It's 40 pages, so I cannot expect people to just go through the report every time. So I'm creating a story or like a shorter bit that will go into the repository and then link to the report, and then it maybe has a few bullet points and so on. Like that's the way this works right now. But I feel like even this is not ideal, because people will be like, okay, maybe in the bullet points there's not the thing that I need. Then maybe the search will uncover something from the report, but it's taken out of context. So we're still not there. Like it's still not what it's supposed to be. And really what I would want it to be is to have this almost really central piece of search, but really powerful search, where you can add certain things like the basket that I was talking about. Like these are all the things that I need. And then you have this like package that you can take away, like something that is usable. I think that's what a lot of tools really are lacking right now. And it's not just the tool, it's kind of the principle of how do we cut and slice our insights and how do we really make them available. But I think that's what's really missing, because in the end, people love having research or insights. Everyone loves it. Like it's so satisfying if you think, okay, I need this to answer my question, and I'm going away and I find these things. So I think that there's nothing wrong about that, like this job to be done, if you will. It's just really that the execution right now is kind of lacking in terms of ease of use and usability, really. But I feel like, yeah, that would be ideal if everyone, and that's so individual, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that every person going into a place like a repository has such individual needs or has such individual questions that it has to be different for everyone coming in there. And I hope this is kind of understandable what I mean. Like it's kind of just a thought. So again, I don't have the perfect solution, but I think conceptually that would be what
Oh damn! I hope you would just describe how everyone can fix that biggest problem that everybody has been working for the last like 20 years. I actually like your metaphor with the store a lot. It's like it's like similar to, just imagine Amazon being a physical store. Like you enter the building and it's so good. It's like 200 miles in each direction, right? And it's like 4-dimensional. So here we are. You can pick whatever you want. Like in the real world, it's just impossible. There are too many options, right? At the same time, Amazon managed to shrink those options into manageable UI that maybe doesn't show you everything, but at least it shows you something that might be related to what you're searching for, and there is a way to find different beats that might be useful for you at the moment. So your metaphor with the store is very interesting. It's like concising a very poorly structured universe of different objects into something that is related to a very poorly written request by a user.
Yeah, maybe something like that. Like that's the thing. Essentially, people want to have their questions answered. Nobody says, I want to know the results from the quarterly feedback NPS round that we ran last year or 2 years ago. Like that's not the question that people actually have. Like they want to know, in our existing users, how do they perceive a price increase in this kind of category? Or can we, like, I have this crazy idea and I want to just test if there's anything on it. Like it does something like that in principle resonate with people. You know, these questions that people have, they are so nuanced and so complex. That's not something that currently the systems can really present us with. Like they can't really process it or handle it really well, but it's automatically leading me to, of course, AI. Like that's what everyone is saying and everyone's kind of thinking about and working with. But I think that's where I really have very high hopes that in the future, this is going to help us, because anything else just seems so impossible to create by people. If we think back to the artifacts that we actually have in research repositories, and I know we talked about this a while ago, like the fact that in some companies, if there is just one simple step of extra work added, they will already say, there's no way we're going to do it. And I feel like that sounds quite extreme, but in a way that's the reality. Just a lot of companies don't really say it. Like they will notice further down the line, but it is the reality for a lot of companies. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like how I visualize that is, in most of the cases, researchers are not spoiled by choice and by a lot of tools that are designed specifically for them to make their life easier. In most of the cases, it's just like, yeah, you can borrow a tool from marketing and you need to adjust that, but you need to do it differently. And then you can borrow something from DevOps, but it's completely different use case, so you need to adjust to that tool and so on. So as a result, the research process is extremely difficult, right? You need to have like 20 things in your head all the time, and you need to pay attention to multiple things. And in addition to that, you use several tools that are not designed to help you, so you need to kind of adjust to them, which means that researchers basically use 150% of their brain already. So adding one extra thing on top, it might be a small thing, but it's like 160% now. So it's just impractical. So
Yeah.
and it's not the only thing they need to add. There are probably like 20 different other small things that they need to do. So I totally agree that I saw it multiple times that if a process requires researchers to do one extra thing at the end of the research, it's just no way. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
The idea. Yeah. And that's what kind of brings me to one question I always get when I work with teams is they always say, should we have someone who is dedicated to this? Like, how do we organize ourselves? How do we do this? And I always say, yes, actually you should. Like, you should have one person that is really only thinking about such things. It's maybe not a full-time repository cleanup position, but someone who's really, like, if you're really serious about managing your knowledge better in the company, that's absolutely a job for a person. Like, at least, there's just so much you can do around this. But the reality then again is that people don't have a budget. They don't, maybe they are having a hard time making that case for it, and just saying like, this will make our lives easier, this will make the way we deal with knowledge easier. That's not something where typically the people who decide over headcount say, that's absolutely something we need to do. And then you can do calculations on like how many hours people spend and so on. But in practice, I haven't really seen this be successful. So that's what's making it so incredibly difficult, because then again, it's people who have other things on their plate who will then be like, okay, I need to put such and such amounts of time every week aside to kind of clean up these things and to take care of it. And that's just something that's very hard to maintain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. And I think just to make the situation even more complicated, I think there's a question of what exactly should go into the repository, right, database, because by definition it's kind of a research repository, so assuming that what we see during research should go there. At the same time, what observers see or how they react can be even more important thing. Like, for example, if we brought, I don't know, a director for sales to the usability study, right? And that person saw that, oh, this is why we cannot sell things. This is what we need to fix to double the sale. I would argue that that's insight, not from researcher or not from the user, is as important as everything else during the study, maybe even more important, which also means that all the comments, all the reactions by everyone who ever watched the session or reacted to the session in any way is a part of that metadata that is might be more important than the data itself, which makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, that's true. Like the question, who's actually responsible and who are the people that we train to use the platform, and then you have to buy seats for all those people. Like it just introduces a lot of challenges, and that's what's making it so hard. Because in an ideal world, for sure, it would be something that's super collaborative. Like everyone plays their part, everyone does something, and also something that I mean, that makes total sense, but that I only kind of realized as well reading that book that I talked about before, is that with existing insights, it's not just something that you have and you then are somehow allowed to only go through once. Like it can be something where every person, like again, thinking about this shopping cart analogy maybe, goes in and they have a different question in mind, and they might go away and, highlight certain things and add certain tags, like whenever they need, like this kind of thought about this, like it's not just raw data, we upload it, someone has to do it, so we assign that poor person that has to do it on top of everything else, but then it's done, like then it's finished, so then we can lean back and relax. Like that's not a really good way of seeing it. I think like it's rather, you have to make it available first, and it has to be findable by the people who need it, but then just see it as like a work in progress, where even if I'm a product manager, I don't ever run research, but I have this question, I need to get some answers. I would love them to be empowered to then go away and say, okay, I'm reading this transcript from this usability test and I'm highlighting the things that are important to me. And then I can take this away into my shopping cart. And then at the end, I have everything that I need. Like that's, I think, something that would work a lot better, but it's even harder to then say, okay, in order to do this, people need to understand how the whole system works, and that's, again, something where you have to really be very intentional about, like, how do we roll this out? How do we make people understand this? How do we also justify putting more work on the table of the product manager in this example, which they might not see the value in at first. Like there's a lot of persuasion and a lot of influencing that has to happen. And I think that's generally like, it's such a piece of work compared to what people think initially it is. But again, it also introduces very concrete solutions to some massive problems that companies have at this point, which is why I think it's so important.
After listening to you, I have high hopes for AI as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, if we think about it, like a lot of the manual work that's still being done, it can be done by tools. Like there are so many tools already out there, and they are so powerful already. Of course, there are some considerations, like, is this something I can use for sensitive information? Like if you use open systems that will use data to train their systems further, you might not even be allowed to use it for your research. Like that, there are some things we need to consider. But I think there are just a lot of tools already out there that don't do it. Like, it's safe to use them. So that's kind of the next thing. Like, how do we work with that? How do the tools ideally incorporate these systems as well, so we can have everything in one place and also use it in a really convenient way? So we just have to find a good way to articulate what we need, and then the system will just give us that. That's very close to the ideal I described before, I guess.
Interesting. So it's basically we're trying to structure very poorly structured information to answer questions that we still don't have, that we will have in half a year, which is kind of extremely difficult to do because we don't even know the taxonomy or kind of objects that we want to deal with in the future. But we need to put them into the system now to be able to retrieve them later. And hopefully the AI, I think this is exactly where AI should be good at, right? It can take very poorly structured data and try to kind of extract meaning from that and match with the meaning of a need that we'll have at some point.
Yeah, it's true. And that immediately makes me think of, at least some level of processing that I think has to take place, because one thing that happens quite often when I work with teams on actual UX research and not just repositories is that there might be studies where you have a sample that is helpful, but it's not quite representative of your target customers. For example, if you would just upload all that information, typically AI would use it, give it the same weight as everything else. Like if something is mentioned in there, then it will bring this up and say, this is a very helpful contribution to the question you have. Like this, you should be looking at this. But the researcher who ran that piece of research would say, be cautious. There are some things we can take away from this, but it's not as trustworthy as all the other things that we did, for example. So what I did with a company that I helped set up their repository in the past is to introduce trust levels or trust scores. And it was quite simple. Like it was just 3 levels, I think. And it was trustworthy, something in the middle, and then not trustworthy. I think it was other words, but I forgot. So it was really just about in the metadata or in the fields to indicate, is this something that people can really trust? Or is this something where they should be cautious and be like, okay, this is maybe the first time we heard about this. So we cannot confirm with any of the other things we've done that this is really something we should be doing or we should be listening to. So I think that level of management, if you want to call it like that, or like curating maybe, that's so important, because that's just still something that humans are a lot better at. Maybe if you could eventually, if you have very large amounts of data, the system could in the future like detect that this is an outlier and could be like, yeah, you have to be so careful about this. But at this point it's not like, and that there's still this level of maybe like kind of false answers or hallucination. These things happen too. Like I've tried lots of different tools and I've talked to others about it, and it does happen. So yeah, it's not 100% yes to this, but I feel like it's absolutely where we're going and absolutely what will help us make this really huge and complex topic a lot more tangible and usable. Yeah.
I think you made a very good point also about researchers having basically a broader context of the issue, because we're humans, we know kind of, at least we can empathize with research with participants. We know it's in some extent, even if something happened, we know that, for example, it's an outlier or not. And I think in addition to that, after conducting, I don't know, a couple of hundreds of sessions, kind of you train your own mental model on how people think. So in some cases, kind of you can predict what how people might behave, or it is some aspects of that, which kind of I started to observe a very bizarre situation where, specifically for repositories, I keep seeing, especially in large companies, people responsible for ops saying that they actually don't need to deal with that because GDPR and other privacy-related regulations. So as soon as they force us to delete everything, we'll just delete everything and that's okay, job done. We don't need to think about all those complicated questions because it's we don't keep anything further than, let's say, 6 months or 3 months, which I think leads, or at least might lead, to the situation where we do have a tool that can take in tens of thousands of videos, for example, with research sessions, and get that broader context like researchers do. But in large organizations where they, I think, in the ideal situation to generate that context and keep those videos, they delete them because they don't know what to do with them at the moment, and it's much easier from the legal perspective just to say, yeah, we delete everything, instead of finding a justification why you actually need to keep at least parts of that.
Yeah.
And one of the solutions I saw was that researchers insist on keeping at least small kind of snippets of videos, which again lead to the same issue that you pointed out, that we're not sure that that specific snippet is actually representative and relevant for the broader picture. So unless you're a researcher who conducted the study and you know why you decided to cut out this specific bit, there is no way of knowing.
Yeah, that's the thing. And that kind of leads me to an experience I had quite recently with the last startup that I worked with. So for them, this really big piece of research that I did, which was very strategic, and it was like this huge project, 30 different interviews and like all of like end to end. That was really what I did. And I had these typical questions that I have had so many times before, which is like, okay, you chose to show us this example. Like I showed some clips in the readout and in the final presentation, and people were like, yeah, that was so useful. But it's also, you know, we have to see this with a distance, like this is just one person, and, you know, all these doubts they had about it, which I was very happy they brought up, because in that situation I could explain and say, yes, this is just one example, but it is representative of the sample that we had. And it's something that it's a big theme, like it's a pattern that a lot of people had. And immediately this also made me think about, like, what if they hadn't brought it up, that maybe they just wouldn't believe, because it was also a very uncomfortable truth. Like it was something that someone said in a very sharp way. Like that was a person who was very good at, you know, finding the right words also. And for them it was like, yeah, but she is also someone who works in marketing, so that is not, you know, that's not something we want to believe because she's in that area, you know, things like that. People will come up with these all sorts of reasons why this person then is not really someone they should listen to. And that's classically where the researcher comes in and then educates and says, hey, I can explain this to you. It's actually good that you brought it up. It's still very valid. You still need to listen to this. But yeah, if I hadn't been there, they would probably just dismiss it. And I think that's just something I, again, don't have the ideal solution for that, because it's a very human thing. It's a very like communication-based thing. That would be hard to imagine how a system would do that right now. But yeah, it's important to not forget about these things. Like when people search for insights, they are not just searching for words on a screen. They also search for context, and they want to feel comfortable using something. And if it's uncomfortable, they need to be convinced that this is also something they should consider.
Interesting. And I guess in some cases, kind of this database of evidence, it can be built over time. So for example, one participant that we wouldn't believe we tested half a year ago, another participant who behaved in the same way we tested 3 months ago, and then the third participant yesterday, for example. And if we don't keep all the data and we don't have a way to accumulate those findings, we would never be able to see the pattern.
Yeah, that's also true. Like it's very problematic. What you just mentioned also, like the deleting policies that a lot of companies have, like that's hurting the core thought or the essence of a repository, I think, because that's it's also in previous roles years ago where AI wasn't really a topic, like nobody was talking about it. I also always felt, and I was in the situation once where I was the only researcher in a very big company, that all this knowledge was really with me, like it was in my head. I was the one who ran studies every single week, and I was the one who reviewed all the NPS feedback, like the open-ended feedbacks, and it was tens of thousands of feedback. Like I just knew when someone would tell me, we have this idea, like this is something we're thinking about, is this something we should be doing? I could tell them because I had all of this in my head, but I was having this balanced view as well, because I practiced and I repeatedly like downloaded all of this into my brain. And I think if I then would go away and only pick the last month of feedback or the last month of studies, of course it would be so extremely different. And that's just something, yeah, I don't know like what a solution to that could be. Like maybe there's a way to make information more GDPR compliant without taking it away. Like that's something I have seen some people do, but I also worked with companies before that said there is no way, like we cannot take parts of it. The company rule is to delete it after 3 months. That's the promise. That's what we have to do. So in those cases, you will probably never have a really powerful repository then.
Interesting. What you just said in a weird way leads to kind of machines probably being in charge, because what I think even now is possible to do, you can extract, you can convert speech to text first, right? So you have the transcript, and you can keep that. You can, in theory, extract some key reactions from the user and keep that not as a user identifiable data. So you can keep that instead of keeping images and pictures. Yeah. So in the end, in theory, machines should be able to combine pieces of that information and make a decision on that, but humans would not, because it would not be in a human consumable way, consumable kind of mode, which is a weird thing. It's kind of we want to protect people by deleting things that only people can understand.
Yeah, that's true. Like that's a really weird workaround in that sense. We also, like, that's a bit random, but it also makes me think about a usability lab that I observed many years ago, like it was 2019, I think. And there was this technology that the company or the agency used that was meant to automatically detect the emotions that people had, based on the face recording. And we just, we laughed so much during that session because it was so inaccurate. And I'm sure it has been refined since, but they were like, someone would think about something and it would show like maximum angriness and things like that. Like it was so funny, but also in a way we were thinking like, okay, we as a company, we just paid a lot of money to get this done. It's so widely inaccurate. And I think this kind of, it's probably not just me who has these really deeply rooted associations with these kinds of topics. So I'm sure that the other part that makes it difficult is the acceptance, because then, of course, researchers are typically people who are very diligent and who are very like, okay, this has to be done in the right way. And we have to make sure that we really do quality work. And if we just replace that with something like that, that's not it. Like, that's not something we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We've been talking for about an hour, so I think maybe we can wrap up this kind of session. Can I ask a couple of questions in the end?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So the first one is, if you can travel back in time and give, let's say, advice to yourself, what 3 things you would like to do differently or pay attention to when you just started? So your experience now, travel into the past and talk to when you just started in the field, what would you say? What advice would you give?
Yeah. One thing that immediately comes to mind is to think more about how I fit into a company. So when I started, I was so focused on doing my best work and just doing everything right and so on. But I so painfully in some parts realized later on that when we work in companies, no matter the size really, it's so much more important how you really fit in and how you make yourself heard and how you kind of communicate. Like, communication is the key thing, I feel, that makes people successful or not successful. And I'm naturally more on the introvert side. So it's usually quite hard for me to be like, okay, here I am, and here are these great things that I want to talk to you about. But that's definitely something I should have learned earlier, to have this kind of switch where I can say, this is important. If I want to have impact, I need to do this now. The other thing is probably to try and be a bit more open to doing things differently. So especially in the beginning, I was very much like, okay, I need to write a research report. There's got to be the perfect template for this somewhere. And then I'm just going to do it exactly like that, because that's what people will appreciate and will like and so on. But then I had this really key moment once where I was in a big open office, and I actually sat behind the person I just sent a report to. And I've been working on this for such a long time, and I made it perfect, and the slides were so beautiful. And then I saw him open it and kind of scroll all the way through to the end summary. And I was like, okay, that was, at first I was offended. That was my natural reaction. But then it just made me realize so early on that what's the point in doing something that I think is standard and that everyone does if all this person needs is really just one slide? That's something I do now. Like, I always like to remind myself and others that just because there exists a way to do it doesn't mean you have to do it. Like, just focus on what really adds value, and it will make your life so much easier along the way. Like, not spending weeks and weeks to create a huge report if what people need is really just a quick summary of the key findings, for example. And then the third thing, I guess, I don't know if that counts, but I already kind of mentioned it, but the communication side of things. So it's something I'm almost obsessed with recently, and I read a lot of books about it, but really how we can have difficult conversations, but still make all the involved people successful in a way. Like, very often in the past I saw, and I still see these posts somewhere where people say like, product managers versus designers, who wins, and so on. Like that, I think that's a really bad way of seeing it, because oftentimes we all want to be successful, but people fail at the part where they don't communicate really well, and they go to their managers and complain and say, this person is so hard to work with. Whenever I hear this, that's a huge red flag to me, because I feel like it's our job or our responsibility to find ways to work with people and to be successful doing so. And that can mean a lot of different things. But now that I'm a freelancer as well, and my environment and my work changes very quickly all the time, I feel like that's the key thing that's holding everything together. It's just being able to work with very different people with very different goals. But communication is really the one thing that sticks everything together. And it's not something I focused on in the beginning so much. So yeah, it was a big learning along the way.
Interesting. It's very interesting that all the advice is related basically to consulting in general, not even to research or research ops.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's the fourth thing, is that just because your role is researcher doesn't mean that you're only researching. Like, it's so much more than that. At least if you want to be successful, I feel like that's something we all need to learn. Like, how do we become really good consultants as researchers as well, or research ops people for that matter? The ones that are really successful, I think, are also really good consultants or coaches even. Like the ones that are not just super transactional and like, you asked for this, I delivered this, and then I'm away. And then I get angry when you don't do the things I recommended. Like, you know, the reality is a bit more complicated than that. Yeah.
Nice. Johanna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was invaluable.
It was a pleasure.